apologize for being late. Actually, I wasn't late. I had to attend to something. If I'd have been late, I'd blamed it on Betty, and that would not have been good. So, we finished Isaiah. Finally. It just seems to me that a natural sequel to Isaiah would be Jeremiah. So we're going to start a study of Jeremiah. And what do we know about Jeremiah? Well, pardon me? He's a weeping prophet. Now let's just start right there. He was a weeping prophet. Kathy, what was the source of his weeping? What's the reason? Okay. Now Isaiah, 100 years before, was very instrumental in saving Judah. I mean, his words, he was very instrumental. He worked with the government. He worked with the kings. And God preserved Israel for years, decades after Isaiah. But now Jeremiah, we could say, worked just as hard, and he endured a lot of personal abuse, and we're going to get into some of that personal abuse that Isaiah endured. But Israel, Judah was not saved. And since Kathy mentioned the weeping prophet, let's go over to Lamentations, the 3rd chapter, and just see what Jeremiah's disposition was. Obviously, he was concerned about his nation. I guess you'd say he was a nationalist. He was a patriot. In addition to being a prophet of God, being called by God to be a prophet, and being called to do, an awesome task. But he really, I suppose, in his mind, failed. He failed to help preserve Judah. Now, when we go about a task, and it's a difficult task, like teaching autistic kids, we go about doing something that's really difficult and a lifelong endeavor, and we consider, after all that we failed, how do we feel? Right? Discouraged, depressed. Well, in the third chapter, and I suppose we could feel like maybe God wasn't, kind to us, or God wasn't listening to us. When Jonah went into Nineveh, although he didn't want to go, and we know about his disposition, but the people there repented at God's word, And he preserved that national group. Now, although Jonah didn't want to do it, he was very successful. Well, let's think of, since Kathy brought this up, let's just kind of look let's just look in the 3rd chapter of Lamentations, and Jeremiah wrote Lamentations. He says, I am the man that hath seen affliction. Well, he certainly had seen affliction by the rod of his wrath. He hath led me and brought me into darkness, but not into light. Surely against me is he turned. He turned his hand against me all the day. Now, what does that sound like? That sounds like that sounds like Jeremiah felt that God was not, on his side, so to speak. My flesh and my skin hath he made old. He hath broken my bones. He hath builded against me and compassed me with gall. That's another idea. That idea there is bitterness and hardship and travail. And he hath set me in dark places, as they that be dead of old. He hath hedged me about, that I cannot get out. He hath made my chain heavy. Now, this is a description of a guy that is really feeling lonely and sorry for himself, and feeling like a failure, I think. And when I cry and shout, he shutteth out my prayers. He hath enclosed my ways with hewn stone. He hath made my paths crooked. He was unto me a bear lying in wait, and a lion in the street. He hath turned aside my ways and pulled me in pieces. He hath made me desolate. He hath bent his bow and set me as a mark for the arrow. He hath caused the arrows of his quiver to enter my reins, or my heart. And on he goes. And so, when Kathy says he was a weeping prophet, he's not only weeping for, and of course this was written after the destruction of Jerusalem by the hands of the Babylonians in 586 BC. But I think he was saying here that he was kind of a failure. Well, what else do we know about Jeremiah besides being the weeping prophet? We know that he lived about 100 years after Isaiah. We mentioned that Isaiah helped to save Judah, and then, but Jeremiah, as a prophet of God, seemed like he was a failure in that he didn't save Judah from Babylonian captivity. But what did Isaiah say about the Babylonian captivity decades before? He said that Judah would go into Babylonian captivity. So this was prophesied by Isaiah that would happen. Now, Jeremiah, according to the 1st chapter, was the son of the priest Hilkiah. Now, he was from Anathoth, a priest city there outside of Jerusalem, and he came to the office of being a prophet of God during the period of time that Josiah was king of Judah. Now, a little bit of background in terms of the world situation at that point in time. Assyria, and we've talked about Assyria quite a bit here on Sunday morning, But Assyria was kind of the dominant power in the world, in that area of the world, for about 300 years. Assyria was picking at the Jerusalem, the Israeli area periodically. And finally God allowed Assyria to remove the 10 tribes, the northern tribes, take them into captivity, take them into destruction, and of course killed a lot of them in the battle there when they came in to overtake the northern tribes. Well, the southern tribes were saved at that point in time. Now, Isaiah talked about this Babylonian group. The Babylonian group was in, I believe, in the southern end of this Tigris-Euphrates area. And Babylon wasn't a world power at the time that Isaiah talked about the Jews going into Babylonian captivity. But the Babylonians increased in power in the world community at that time. And then down in the Nile Valley, the River Nile Valley, we had Egypt. That 1,000 years before Jeremiah, Egypt was a world power, dominant power. Now after 1,000 years, Egypt came into, world, thinking about dominating the world. Now I wonder why it is that, America is considered, what are we, among the nations, what are we considered? In terms of power. Yeah. Pardon me? The United States has been considered the leader of the Western world, so to speak, right? And I wonder why it is that there's through history there's been somebody that's been, the world power. It was the Assyrians, and then the Babylonians, and then who followed that group? The Persians, the Medo-Persians, and then who followed them? Alexander the Great, the Grecians, and then who followed? Roman. And then, all down through history, nations have, somebody has been identified as kind of the leader, the powerful group. Well, here we have these three, externally from here, we have these three nations, these three civilizations. We have the Assyrians who are on the way out, so to speak, the Babylonians who are on their way up, and the Egyptians who've, generally speaking, they've always been kind of a threat, in that area of the world. And so you have this infighting among these three nations, that is Assyria, Babylon, and Egypt. And here's this little plot of real estate that we call Judah, kind of in the middle of all this. Now, so during Isaiah's time, the leadership, the political leadership, was always trying to make book with Egypt. They were allied with Egypt. They were, and God didn't approve of that. His view was, God's view was, they ought to depend on him and not some, Egyptian power or somebody else. So now we have these three competing nations, and this little plot of ground there that we call Jerusalem, and the environments of Jerusalem. And here we have this little plot of ground, this group of people at this point in time, not very powerful. And God calls Jeremiah to be the prophet. In verse 5 of the first chapter, calls him to be the prophet of the nations. Verse 5, before I formed thee in the belly, I knew thee, and before you camest forth out of the womb, I sanctified thee, and I ordained thee a prophet unto the nations. Well, that's kind of an interesting assignment. Prophet to the nations. See, here's Israel, was right here in kind of in the middle as a nation, and the kings of Judah were kind of maneuvering and manipulating and trying to hang on. And so what affected Judah affected the other nations, right? What affected Judah affected the other nations. And so in a sense, he was a prophet to the nations. Now, we know that from Jeremiah and the Chronicles and the Second Chronicles, near the end of the Second Chronicles, near the end of the Second Kings, we know that when the nation fell, when Jerusalem fell, some of the people from that Judean area, along with Jeremiah, where'd they go? Egypt. Now we have over here in Babylon lots of the Jews that weren't killed in the invasion, the Babylonian invasion, and they're over there in Babylon. And who were some of the people, some of the Jewish people that got into Babylon and got into, made their mark on history? Who were some of those people? Daniel was over there in the Babylonian government. And then when the Babylonians fell, and the Medo-Persian group came in, what happened to Daniel? Continued on for a while. Now, who was the prophet during this period of time? During the period of time when the Babylonians took the Jews over, took them into captivity. Who was the prophet there in Babylon? The prophet to the Jews in Babylon. Ezekiel was the prophet there. And Ezekiel was contemporary with Jeremiah. And Daniel, when I say contemporary with, their lives overlapped somewhat. There's Daniel, was contemporary with Daniel in the government of Babylon. And then there were other, and we'll mention others. There was contemporary with Jeremiah was Nahum and Habakkuk, and then Zephaniah was another prophet, and there was that was in the Jerusalem area, and there's still another prophet. I've lost his name in my mind here, but the point is, and we'll get more specific about this later, if I remember to do so. But we had all of these, these interactions going on in the various empire, the various countries of the world there. So on on an international situation, we have quite a messy political situation. Now, internally, within the Jewish community, Jeremiah had a lot of things to deal with when he was called to be a prophet, called to be the prophet of the nations. Let's go to the 2 Chronicles 35 for just a moment to kind of get a view of the internal situation. 2 Chronicles 35. Okay, and just a little review here. Let's start with 2 Chronicles 34. Yeah, let's just start with 34 here. Josiah was 8 years old. Now, Jeremiah was commissioned to be a prophet about the 13th year of Josiah's reign. Josiah, the king of Judah, about the 13th year. And Josiah was 8 years old when he began to reign, and he reigned in Jerusalem 31 years. Now, Jeremiah was his prophet, his office of prophecy, so to speak, or he was a kind of a 40-year veteran as a prophet. And Josiah was in his 13th year as king when Jeremiah came on the scene as a prophet. So that gives you a little sense of where how Josiah and Jeremiah connected. Josiah was a young pup when he started to reign. He, according to the record, was a good king. He was involved in quite a restoration movement, trying to restore the Judean, Jerusalem, the people of Jerusalem, of Judah, to the law of Moses. He had a difficult task as a political leader. Josiah had a difficult task because the people had been, by previous kings, particularly by granddad Manasseh, the people had been just steeped in idolatry. And so we have a political leader coming along, going to do some restoration. Now, do you suppose by a snap of the finger, by Josiah just, saying that we're going to have reforms, we're going to go back to Jehovah God, we're going to go back to the law of Moses, we're going to restore the temple, we're going to restore religion? Do you suppose all the people, just by the snap of the finger, do you suppose they all say, "Oh yeah, great, we're all going to be penitent"? You suppose they followed up? Well, Jeremiah was out there. Josiah was in the political office. Jeremiah and other prophets were out there in the field, so to speak, preaching and teaching, prophesying, and in combination of these prophets, Jeremiah had some help, And his father, Jeremiah's father, Hilkiah, was involved in the restoration. But do you suppose everybody jumped on board? All the Jews jumped on board with a good political leader and all this preaching, drawing people. You suppose everybody just jumped on the bandwagon and became religious and probably not. Let's suppose in America, let's suppose we had a real true Christian president, and he started, or she started, a restoration of Christianity in America, I suppose, and we had preachers throughout the land preaching. Do you suppose everybody would just jump on board? They'd probably try to, in our country, impeach somebody like that, right? Why wouldn't they all jump on board? Well, because, the culture has been changed by some of these previous kings. And they're not just going to, because a preacher or because a political leader tries to reform. Some of them. I mean, that would be better than a bad president or a bad leader, But they're not just, the people aren't just going to, en masse, jump on board. And that's what took place there. That was the phenomena that took place here in Judah. But let's look at beginning in the 34th chapter. Pardon me? Yeah. Well, the kings were from the kings of Judah were from the family of David. Okay, and a child of David became king, and then a grandchild of David, and then a great grandchild. There was that succession of kings. Yeah. Well, I mean, he had the title of king, but he had advisors and people that were working with him. But in the southern tribe, and we have to remember that back during the end of Solomon's reign, the country split. The nation of Israel split into Judah and the 10 northern tribes, okay? And the 10 northern tribes had a king that wasn't from the family of David. And so the only thing we can say here is Josiah was in that lineage of David, you see, okay? But he was a good king. And here Hilkiah, let's go to 34, 2 Chronicles 34 and 22. Hilkiah in verse 22, I think we have to assume that Hilkiah here was the father of Jeremiah, because in the first chapter of Jeremiah it says the words of Jeremiah the son of Hilkiah, of the priests that were in Anathoth in the land of Benjamin, just somewhat outside of Jerusalem. So assuming that this priest was during the reign of Josiah, and let's just follow that for a moment. In verse 22 of 2 Chronicles 34, he says, "And Hilkiah and Hilkiah, and they that the king had appointed went to Huldah, the prophetess, the wife of Shallum, the son of Tikvath, the son of Hashrah, keeper of the wardrobe. Now she dwelt in Jerusalem in the college, and they spake to her to that effect. And she answered them, saying, And thus saith the Lord God of Israel, Tell ye the man that sent you to me. Now, this was in response to, during this period of when Josiah started this Reformation, he didn't have much, it doesn't seem to me, he had much real knowledge to go on, except he was going to reform. But during this period of Reformation, they found the book in the temple. They were cleaning out the temple, getting all that idolatrous material out of the temple. They found the book. Well, what book did they find? Well, they found the law of Moses. They found the book. And when they found the book, Hilkiah was involved there. And thus, in verse 24, and thus the Lord said, the Lord, Behold, I will bring evil upon this place, is what the book says, and upon the inhabitants thereof, and even and all the curses that are written in the book, which they had read before the king of Judah. Verse 25, because they had forsaken me, according to the information that was in they were finding out from the law of Moses, and they'd burn incense to other gods and so forth. And down to verse 26, and as for the king of Judah, who sent you to inquire of the Lord, so shall ye say unto him, Thus saith the Lord God of Israel concerning the words which thou hast heard, because thine heart was tender and did humble thyself before God, when thou heardest his words against this place and against the inhabitants thereof, and humblest thyself before me, and did rent thy clothes and weep before me, I have even heard thee also, saith the Lord. Now this is speaking here, of course, of Josiah. And behold, I will gather thee to thy fathers, and thou shalt be gathered to thy grave in peace. Neither shall thine eyes see all the evil that I will bring upon this place and upon the inhabitants of the same. So they brought the king word again. Now, Josiah was promised what? According to this, that he wouldn't see the destruction. But was there any indication here that the destruction would not come? The destruction was going to happen, you see. Then the king sent and gathered together all the elders of Judah and Jerusalem. And the king went up into the house of the Lord, and all the men of Judah and the inhabitants of Jerusalem, and the priests and the Levites and all the people, great and small. And he read in their ears all the words of the book of the covenant which was found in the house of the Lord. And the king stood in his place and made a covenant before the Lord, to walk after the Lord, and to keep his commandments and his testimonies and his statutes with all his heart and with all his soul, and to perform the words of the covenant which are written in the book. And he caused all that were present in Jerusalem and Benjamin to stand, and the inhabitants of Jerusalem did according to the covenant of God, the God of their fathers. And Josiah took away all the abominations and so on. And then just following on down to the chapter 35. Moreover, Josiah kept the Passover unto the Lord in Jerusalem, and they killed the Passover in the 14th day of the first month. And so there was a real reform that was taking place there. And the reason I wanted to get into that is that no doubt Jeremiah, the son of Hilkiah, he came to the office in the 13th year of Josiah's rule, and this was probably this great Reformation started probably in about the 15th or 16th year of the rule. And so Jeremiah, no doubt, was involved in helping with these reforms, working with the people in terms of helping with these reforms. So Josiah and Jeremiah then I'm sure had a good working relationship, right? But then later on we're going to find that the kings following Josiah were rotten to the core. They were bad. And they were bad even in view of all of this information that was being distributed by not only Jeremiah but other prophets, as I believe Zephaniah being another one of the prophets that was contemporary there in Jerusalem with Jeremiah. But then, what do you suppose happened when Josiah left the scene and Jeremiah continued to preach reform and continued to preach, they ought to repent, and continued to preach that Babylon was going to take over? What do you suppose the reaction of the kings would then have been? Well, let's suppose you were the king of Judah and you believed that you could save the country from the Babylonians, and you had a preacher out here or prophets out here saying, might as well give up. God is going to send, you're going to have to submit to the Babylonians. What are they going to think about Jeremiah? Traitor! You're against the country. You're sold out to the enemy. Lock them up. We've heard that statement before, haven't we? Lock them up. And at some period of time, they had Jeremiah in a cistern. You know what a cistern is? We had an old house on the farm. We didn't use that house. Somebody else used it. They ran water from the roof into the cistern. And you sophisticated city people wouldn't understand anything about that. Running rainwater into a cistern, would you?
That's what you call female Christian. You got your brethren, you got your sisters.
I checked the dictionary about that, and it's not there. It's not there. That's it. So, here's Jeremiah getting this. He's during some period of his time getting the support of his president, his king, and then next king's bad. And then he gets. Not only was he thrown in a cistern, we're going to find out in our study, he was put in stocks. What's that mean? Constrained all over. Legs, arms, head, whatever. He was abused and abused and abused by these bad kings, and not only the kings, but his countrymen. Anybody ever spoken to a group or preached? Well, Tim, you probably have. And you kind of read faces of people sometimes, don't you? Can you read faces? Yeah. And you see somebody going, not good. They're not. You're getting to them. I remember one time there's a woman sitting about right in here. Mark was preaching, and this woman stood up and said, "You're a false teacher." She was right here in the middle. But Ned, you remember that? Yeah. Anyway. I'm sorry?
I was sitting behind her too. I think she said, wasn't that the case where she said, my husband was baptized in the baptism of fire?
I think so, yeah.
Slow down.
Yeah. So, well,
Well, what happened?
she left. I won't get any details as to why he left. Huh? She left. Anyway, I'm sorry I brought that up because it distracted. That distracted from the point. The point being that I can imagine lots of those fellow Jews were just thinking, this is some kind of a nut. This Jeremiah is some kind of a nut. Well,
Billy, I remember one time with Jeremiah, he taught an object lesson, and one of the false prophets broke his object.
that wasn't about the potter.
No.
That was about the yoke. Yeah. So well, Jeremiah was, he was born outside of Jerusalem. He was born in Anathoth, and so he had no doubt some country. He had, no doubt had some country illustrations. Well, we're going to finish next week. We're going to finish introducing Jeremiah's prophecy and